Welcome to Sound Bites, a mini podcast on the Sound at Heart Podcast Network. Today is Monday, January 13th, and I am Jeremiah Oshan. On today's show, I'll be talking about my quick impressions from the first official day of Sounders training and giving a bit of a primer on what to expect in preseason.
Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, Oshan! Let's go!
Although players first started reporting on Saturday, they did physicals and all those kinds of things. Monday was actually the first real day of training where they got outside and sweat, and they just basically ran around, worked up their heart rate, and then did a little bit of short-sighted games. It was a good day. Everyone seemed to be in a very good mood, but there wasn't a lot necessarily going on. I will note that Paul Rothrock and Reed Baker-Whiting were not doing any ball work yet. They were training off to the side. They're still recovering from the injuries they suffered at the end of last season. Sounds like they will be worked back into training and probably should be all ready to go by the time the team takes off for Spain, which is going to be on Sunday. And then they're going to be in Marbella, Spain for like 18 days, something like that, a pretty long time. They'll play a handful of games, or not a handful. They'll play a few games out there, and then they'll come back sometime around early February and then get ready for the first game of the season, which is February 19th in Guatemala in CONCACAF Champions Cup. MLS home opener is February 22nd. That is like 5 weeks away. It's kind of crazy to think about. 6 weeks away, I guess. But anyway, the first day of training, it was a good time. Everyone seemed very happy. Just about everyone was there that you would expect. I will note there was no Kim Keehee. I don't have any updates on what's going on there other than the Sounders are sort of trying to work something out with that. I did find out that Kim is not actually out of contract at Ulsan, so it is a little bit more complicated than it may seem. Apparently, he does have a desire to come back to the United States. The Sounders have a desire to bring him in. I would imagine if they can all sort of come to an agreement on financial terms, maybe Ulsan will just let him go. I don't know if that's really how it works, but maybe. The other notable person that wasn't there is Jesus Ferreira. He is, of course, with the U.S. national team. I don't know if he is going to return. I know he's not going to return in time to be part of the Longacres portion of training. I am not sure if he will stay with the U.S. national team for their whole camp, which would keep him in, which would mean he'd have to go to Spain separately from the Sounders, and he'd end up missing out on, 10 days, 2 weeks worth of training with his new teammates. Not ideal, but I assume the Sounders are going to sort of defer to him on what he wants to do. My understanding is they basically blocked they didn't totally block Jackson Reagan from going to the U.S. national team January camp. They told U.S. Soccer that they could have him, but they needed him back by the 18th so that he could go to Spain with the rest of the team. U.S. Soccer apparently was not interested in that compromise, and they said, look, if we can't have him for the whole time, we don't want him at all. The situation with Ferreira is a little different. He was technically with FC Dallas when that camp started, so the Sounders did not have the same sort of rights in that situation. And Dallas had already approved of him to go to the U.S. national team camp. The Sounders could recall him, but I don't think they're going to do that unless Ferreira is on board with it. They don't want to get off to a bad start with their new player. So anyway, other than Ferreira, everyone else was out there. There were also a bunch of Defiance guys. And a few players who I couldn't identify. Among the players who were there who are not first team players that I was able to identify, Kalani Kosarienzi, Osaze de Rosario, Lars Hellerin, Snyder Brunel, and Mohamed Shower. Those are all players who are under contract with Tacoma Defiance. They seem to fit right in. I would imagine we're going to see them all sort of periodically training with the first team this year. They are players who I would imagine will get first team minutes, even if they don't sign full first team contracts. And then there were, among the new faces that I was able to identify, Leo Burney, who is the new homegrown player, Travion Sousa. He was a Defiance player, obviously. And then there were a couple others who Damian Alvarez was a draft pick out of Seattle University. And then there were one or two other guys who I thought I knew who they might be. I am not as sure now after kind of cross-checking with photos that I found online. So, there might be a couple of mystery players there. I would imagine they were probably more likely to sign with Defiance. I don't think there are any first-team trialists. We've kind of moved beyond that. We don't get a lot of first-team trialists anymore. That's something that used to happen a lot, up until, I don't know, 2017, 2018. And in the last few years, certainly post-COVID, we don't get a lot of unnamed players who are just out training with the Sounders who might make the team. That's just not really how it works these days. The sort of star of the first day of training, I guess you could say, was Paul Arriola. That trade was announced right before or earlier this morning, actually at 7 a.m. Pacific. Apparently, Dallas wanted to get that out as soon as possible. But in case you missed the news, the Sounders have picked up Paul Arriola. The Sounders gave up a 2026 first-round draft pick and $300,000 in conditional general allocation money. My understanding on the general allocation money is that it's conditioned on a lot of playing time for Arriola. If he is mostly coming off the bench, I don't think the Sounders are in much danger of having to pay that out. But if he's starting a lot, then I guess that ends up being a worthwhile investment. $300,000 isn't a ton. It's not nothing, but it's not on this year's budget anyway. I also was able to confirm that Dallas is picking up a bunch of his salary. I don't know exactly how much, but combined with the new contract that he's signing with the Sounders, which is 3 years with an option for 2028, my understanding is he's hitting the Sounders salary cap at right around $600,000 or $700,000 a year. So if that's the case, you would imagine Dallas is picking up close to $1 million on his salary this year. I guess the plan is they're just going to eat that. They're not even going to use a buyout because they have a rather embarrassment of riches when it comes to GAM, especially if this transfer for Alan Velasco, goes through. They're supposed to get like $10 million in that. I would imagine they'll be able to clear some GAM. Anyway, they are not super worried about GAM, and they're just kind of going through a full rebuild. And I guess that they made that clear to Arriola at the end of last year that they were planning on doing a full rebuild and that he wasn't really part of their plans. And they sort of gave him the ability to go and see who might be willing to take him. And on the top of his list, at least this is according to him. I have no reason to doubt it, though. He said the Sounders were really pretty much the top team where he wanted to go to. He has some friends here. I guess I should preface this. I would imagine LAFC, LA Galaxy, maybe even San Diego were also on his list as teams that he was interested in pursuing, in part because he's a San Diego guy. He's from Southern California. I believe he still lives down there. But the Sounders were very much at the top of the list. And part of the reason is that he knows that theirs is a winning team. He has gone out in the playoffs to them a couple times. The Sounders and Dallas have had a bunch of good battles. And I'm sure he's sort of looked longingly at the Sounders and said, I want to be able to do this. I want to play in multiple competitions. I want to be able to go deep in multiple competitions. And that is, of course, something the Sounders have made a name for themselves doing. He also has a pretty good relationship with Christian Roldan and Jordan Morris. He knows both of them from rather extensive time with the U.S. national team. I would imagine that they have all trained together dozens of times, which is saying something. You don't have players who weren't teammates at the club level who trained together that much. But for a couple of years there, Arriola, Roldan, and Morris were in a ton of camps together, and they got to know each other pretty well. I guess Jesus Ferreira is also in that same group, although I don't know that anyone's not necessarily saying they're quite as close with Ferreira, but Arriola vouched for Ferreira and seems excited to be coming to the Sounders with him. I found him to be really personable. He seems to be a player who I think fans will relate to and sort of bond with. He is a sort of quintessential Brian Schmetzer player, I'd say. He hustles. He likes to get under opponent's skin. He does have some skill. This is a guy, he's now 29 at what, he said it himself. There was a time where he was a young up and comer. There was a time where and this is his word, he said, there was a time where I was a superstar. And now he's sort of in the phase of his career where he just wants to win games. And it makes a lot of sense for a player like that to want to come to the Sounders. He has been, you know, I think it'll be interesting to see how he's used. Brian Schmetzer talked about him being mostly used as a wide player, either as a wing back or as a winger. He talked about him potentially. I think we can probably see him, imagining him play on either side of either of those positions. We might even see him at fullback, I suppose. He doesn't have great defensive numbers. He is in some ways sort of a mirror image in terms of the opposite effects. Maybe that's too strong. He is a interesting complementary part, I'll say, to a Alex Roldan, who right now is much more of a defensive player than he is an offensive player. Roldan has had some good offensive years. Last year was not one of them, but he was a very good defender last year. I guess you could say the same thing about Nuhu, who's never really been an offensive player, but is much more of a defensive player. And so having an Arriola on the roster as someone that they can use gives them an interesting change that they can go to. Zooming out a little bit, Brian Schmetzer talked about the formation a little, but it sounded to me like he's still sort of defaulting to playing in a 4-2-3-1. But he also mentioned prominently, going to a 3-5-2 at times. And one of the big battles, I think, during this preseason, and probably maybe the thing to watch, is how he solves a couple different issues. The first one, I think the biggest one is going to be who's playing number 9. Jesus Ferreira has had a lot of success there. So has Jordan Morris. And so it'll be interesting to see who gets the nod there. Maybe they both do. Maybe we end up with a 3-5-2, like I said, and we see both of them playing up top together. My impression, though, is Ferreira will probably play on the right, at least to start, with Jordan Morris as the number 9, and then we'll see how it goes. And if things have to change, they'll change. But I think that's one big battle we're going to want to see. And then I think one of the other ones is Pedro de la Vega and how he fits in. Now, if they're playing in a 4-2-3-1, I could see him playing either on the right or the left. I think he could, I think it's hard to imagine a world where he and Paul Arriola are on the field together. It feels like they are probably it would be the toughest to kind of fit a lineup where they're both together. Although I suppose there's no reason that they couldn't both be on the wings in a 4-2-3-1. But that's going to be an interesting one. And I also think that one of the reasons the 3-5-2 is not really the default is because I don't know where Pedro de la Vega plays in that. Maybe they'll try him at wing back. That would be an interesting choice. I don't imagine that the Sounders really see that as an ideal situation, but I could see them going, okay, well, we got to make the most out of this. But I think De La Vega is probably the biggest question mark. He's probably the player who offers the most untapped upside at this point. And again, that's going to be really interesting to watch. And then one of the other things that we talked about with Schmetzer today, and as something else worth watching, is Josh Atencio, who Craig Weibel mentioned this a couple times in conversations this year, was the possibility of moving Atencio to center back. And I wouldn't say that he made it sound like an afterthought, but I don't know that he really communicated the seriousness with which the Sounders are approaching this. And I think we got a better sense of that in talking to Brian Schmetzer, where he basically said, look, we want to try it. We think this is a potentially a really good position for him. We want to try it, and we're willing to have some growing pains because we believe this is a potentially good move for him. Now, I tend to think that Atencio, Brian Schmetzer has said this himself. This is a player who's a little too mobile to pigeonhole as a center back. But I suppose with Obed Vargas and Christian Roldan probably locking down the starting spots there, and João Paulo likely sucking up a lot of the backup minutes, and then maybe a Snyder Brunel as well getting in there, that maybe Atencio just, the path to playing time is just maybe not as clear as it looked before. I would still think that Atencio would be a good third option but and maybe even a direct backup to. I mean, I really like him. If you look at his numbers, they're almost off the charts in terms of per 90 defensive actions and those kinds of things. But I also understand the desire to move him to center back because he doesn't have a clear starting spot. And I think there's also a concern that there's maybe not a clear future. There's not a clear path to, even if Obed gets sold in the summer, that it's not totally obvious that Josh Atencio is the first choice player there. And if you can craft a world where he can play next to Jackson Reagan, and then that allows you to maybe move Yamar before he, this is a player who's getting a little older, and it allows you to move Yamar while he still has some value. Maybe that's what it does. But in any case, Schmetzer seemed to indicate that they're going to at least give Atencio the whole preseason to try to figure out center back. And I think he probably becomes the third center back if that's what they end up doing. I alluded to this situation earlier in the show, but Kim Keehee coming in might, if they ever get him, I don't know, maybe that changes the equation a little bit. But I think the bigger picture is long term, they see Atencio potentially being a high level center back. And if they can figure out a way for Jackson Reagan and him to sort of grow together, that could be your center back pairing for the next 4 or 5 years. So I can see why they would maybe want to do it. I will also add that Atencio, to me, I don't know this for sure, but to me, it looked like he bulked up a little bit. And so I wonder if he spent and he is a player who takes fitness very seriously, who understands how to shape your body and do all these kind of things. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he bulked up a little bit, especially on the upper body during the off season. And he looked like, he just looked more like a center back than I'd seen him before. So that'll be interesting. That's another big thing that I think I'll be watching. And then outside of that, who knows? I think this roster looks probably as set as it's maybe ever been this early in preseason. There aren't any huge question marks. I think you have a solid starting 10 that easily could be, 12 or 13 players competing for starting minutes. It's going to be fascinating to see how Paul Rothrock fits in, how Georgie Manungu fits in. It'll be interesting. Heck, if Danny Masovsky can have some sort of bounce back year. It was interesting. He was number 17 last year. Paul Arriola ended up with number 17 this year. I don't know all went into that, but Masovsky's wearing 19. So anyway, these are just some of the things that I think we'll be watching as this team gets ready to go into preseason in a season where they are expected to play up to 50, beyond 50 games, which if they're able to get to would be pretty remarkable, but also, we'll see. All that said, I should probably get out of here. I'm going to try, like I said, I'm going to try to do these soundbite episodes a little bit more often than I did last year. I don't know how often they'll be coming out, but we do have another Nos Audietas coming out on Tuesday, or recording it on Tuesday. I'm going to be going on Lobbing Scorchers live later in the week. So lots of podcast content coming through the pipes. But that said, I'm Jeremiah Shan. This is Soundbites, part of the Sounder at Heart podcast network. And I'll catch you next time.
We love you. Let's win another one!